One of the people who will be presented next week is his vice presidential pick. And we are waiting to see who that will be. Let's talk about who's on the short list.
I thought you were about to break the news. I thought you were going to end his vice presidential pick is...
I know, guys, I just, hold on a second. Yeah. No, they don't have it.
We will never give up. We will never concede. It doesn't happen.
Mother Teresa could not beat these charges. And now, if you don't mind, I'm going to go into the icebox and sit for a long time. Thank you very much.
Welcome to the Trump Trials Sidebar from the Washington Post. I'm Libby Casey, and I'm joined here in the Washington Post newsroom by Rhonda Colvin and James Hohmann. So good to see you both. We thought we'd be here today for something unprecedented, the sentencing of a former president for the first time. Donald Trump on 34 felony counts. He was convicted earlier this summer, but that's not happening any longer today because just 10 days ago, the Supreme Court had this really revolutionary immunity decision. We'll talk about that some today and the impact it's having. But kudos to the two of you who had a podcast episode while I was out, immediately reacting to that news. And if our viewers and listeners have questions about just what happened in the immediate aftermath, definitely go back and listen to last week's episode or watch it because it gave so much clarity about how big that news was. But it's continued to really have impact. And it's having impact not just on the federal cases, but potentially on others. So we'll dive into that today. We'll also talk about the upcoming Republican National Convention. It's in Milwaukee next week. We're all going to be there. And it's hitting this moment of the summer after Donald Trump has had some of the luckiest few weeks he could have imagined, both through the courts and also because of all the attention focused on his presumptive opponent, Joe Biden. Let's start in New York and why the sentencing isn't happening today. Rhonda, take it away. Why has this been pushed back?
Well, this is because of the Supreme Court ruling about presidential immunity when it comes to criminal charges. So just really hours after that decision came out, Trump's team that has been defending him in the New York case wrote to the judge saying that they think that the verdict needs to be tossed out and that that the Supreme Court decision nullifies all of this. So the judge has decided to postpone things until the sentencing until September 18th, if it even happens at that point. There is a date that we should be looking at even earlier, which is September 6th. By then, Marchand, the judge in this case, will rule whether or not to toss out the verdict in this case. And that is because Trump's team has asked that the conviction be thrown out because with the Supreme Court decision saying that a president is immune from official acts that happened during his presidency or her presidency, Trump's lawyers believe that some of the evidence that was in the trial, not the crime itself, but that the evidence is associated with official acts because they happened during the time of his presidency. So that's something like some of the phone records that came out and some of the things that had been used when Michael Cohen was questioned. So all of this is in front of Judge Marchand right now. We'll see in the fall how things progress with this case. But this does show you the weight of that Supreme Court decision, that even though it was associated with the federal January 6th case, it now has, sort of tentacles that are touching all the other cases.
Yeah, so like Madeleine Wester, who the president's scheduler, and Hope Hicks, who was the president's communications director, they testified about meetings that happened in the White House. But just because something happened in the White House doesn't necessarily mean it's an official act. So
or it
does it. And we can speculate, but we can't know until it's been decided by a court. And, the Trump mantra, the lawyer mantra was delay, delay, delay. Now it feels like their mantra is derail, derail, derail. And they really have delayed this. And basically what Judge Marchand is going to have to decide is, all right, was there evidence that now would be considered improper because it related to official acts? And would that have changed the outcome, the fact that that was introduced? In this case, if you're being realistic, no. The conduct that Trump was convicted of relates to basically paying this hush money and making false business records on a private matter before the 2016 election, before he was the president.
But some of those payments went out while he was president.
And some of the stuff happened related to the presidency. But ultimately, when you talk to legal experts, they say, this should be the most solid. Similarly with the classified documents case, that's all conduct that happened after he was president. So he also, the alleged obstruction of justice, it's not an official act because he's not the president anymore. But the January 6th case in D.C. and the Fulton County case in Atlanta, those are both sort of squarely in the zone of being directly affected.
I want to talk more about those in a moment. But first, I just want to finish the conversation about the New York case. What does it mean to have sentencing postponed until September, which is less than 2 months out from the presidential election?
Well, less than 2 months out from the election, it's also near the time of what we think will be the second presidential debate, if that happens. We don't know, but all of this just continues to be tied in to the campaign, to the election of president. And it just, I don't know what will happen. None of us do, but it will be.
It's not like Judge Merchan is going to say, okay, you're getting thrown in the slammer, even though you're supposed to be running for president these last, 8 weeks in the sprint to the race to the White House. That would be like, that would not happen given all the ways that Judge Merchan has acted, just made decisions and everything else in the past. But it is incredible to see this potential collision, James.
Well, I think you should write September 18th in pencil because Judge Merchan will make a ruling about this official acts and whether the Supreme Court decision affects his court's decision
in early September.
But then Trump can appeal that before sentencing. And it doesn't necessarily mean the higher court will take it, but it could get bogged down in an appeal over that decision. And then sentencing could be stayed pending the outcome of an appeal because this is new case law that's from the Supreme Court. So I'll believe it when I see it. I expect that Merchan will ultimately say the Supreme Court's decision doesn't affect this case, but then the Trump people will come back and appeal that, and then maybe that buys a delay until after the election so that it's a state court. Trump can't pardon himself. Trump can't drop the charges, but we may not have clarity until after November.
That's true. And then even out of the legal arena, with all the things that James just laid out, it's also in the political arena, you're going to have Republicans who say, why are they doing this weeks before the election? This is unfair. That may influence, voters' decisions, and they may believe some of the things that we've heard from Republicans about, they're weaponizing the justice system against Trump. Those things might, land with voters at that time in the fall.
Or it could be sobering to hear that the former president has a reminder that he was convicted, and it could be sobering if he's sentenced to something that's that feels more visceral, that feels more like a criminal act in its consequences. Yeah.
One of the most significant stories that's come out since our last episode was our colleagues Devlin Barrett and Perry Stein reported last week that Jack Smith and the Justice Department intend to continue moving forward with their case. So we keep talking about the election as the drop dead deadline, but their reporting suggests that really the inauguration is the drop dead deadline, if Trump wins. And so I thought there was great reporting because they're signaling they're going to keep pushing ahead. So we could actually, it's surreal to imagine Trump potentially winning and still going on trial and the trial may not even happen by January 20th, but that is, I think, a timeline we have to start putting on our radar and thinking about.
Yeah, that's a really great point because he would be, if he does win, president-elect for a couple months, not president. So they could essentially keep going on with this.
Justice Department officials told our colleagues that their understanding and their interpretation of DOJ policy, saying you can't indict a sitting president, doesn't include president-elect.
Right.
So it's something to have on our radar.
Perry and Devlin will continue to report out that story, and you can follow their reporting in the Trump Trials newsletter. You can subscribe to that at the Washington Post website. Let's talk more about what Jack Smith is facing right now in the cases he's pursuing. Why don't we pivot to Florida? Judge Cannon, who's had a lot of criticism for the pace at which she's done things, how many sort of times she's had these hearings about things that other judges might have just dispatched with and moved on from. What's next, James?
Yeah, so she is asking for both sides to submit paperwork on whether or not the immunity ruling affects the Florida case. It shouldn't. The conduct in question is all after Trump was president. The obstruction that's alleged is when he didn't have any of the presidential immunity recognized by the Supreme Court. But it seems likely or probable that Judge Cannon, who's very much in the go slow mindset, will schedule a hearing about it to hear arguments from both sides. The other thing that the Trump folks seized on from the immunity decision is Justice Clarence Thomas wrote a concurring opinion where he basically said Jack Smith's appointment isn't constitutional. He's the only justice who signed on to that, but that is a question that has been before Judge Cannon. She actually had 2 days of hearings about it, heard from amici, outside voices to argue whether Smith is kind of technically appropriate in his job, and asked lots of questions of the Justice Department. And Trump's team has seized on that Clarence Thomas concurrence, and it might actually give a lifeline to Judge Cannon to make a decision that at the very least could delay this even more. And
like if she went into the Clarence Thomas way of thinking, which he sort of got from her, then that could just go up.
Exactly.
And even if the highest court said, no, like he's legit, it would take so much time to resolve that.
Exactly.
Yeah. It is incredible, really, that Clarence Thomas took that position. I mean, was that surprising to you, James?
Shocking. I mean, it is. This is something that's been sort of bubbling up on the right for a couple of years. Ed Meese, who was Reagan's attorney general, has been a big advocate of this idea. And it is kind of this special counsel statute is weird. We learned a lot about it during the whole Mueller probe. And, technically Jack Smith does report to Merrick Garland. He is accountable to the attorney general. But it's sort of one of those like abstract legal arguments that's sort of for the academy. So I was surprised. And Clarence Thomas clearly wrote that because he was, I think, clearly trying to signal to Judge Cannon, like, hey, here, if you want to cite this and hang your hat on this. And there is a long history of, there's this 1989 Supreme Court decision that actually upheld the special counsel sort of process. And it was 8-1. The case is Morrison. And the one dissent was Antonin Scalia. And basically, Clarence Thomas, I think, thinks he's like carrying the torch of Scalia by continuing to push this idea and hoping that over time he can win at least 4 other adherents on the high court.
So, Rhonda, what else is Jack Smith contending with right now in the aftermath of the immunity decision and with just all these other forces that have really worked in Donald Trump's advantage over the last couple of weeks?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about it a little bit just a few minutes ago, that it's, whether or not to bring forward that federal January 6th probe, and when to do it, how to do it, how robust it might be given the timeline.
Right, and if items have to be stripped out of it, how much is left?
Right, exactly. And, there's been so much criticism. You've heard it from Democrats. You've also heard it from folks like Liz Cheney, who have been saying, not being able to put this in front of the voters, all the evidence that about Trump's actions leading up to January 6th, trying to subvert the election, it's unfair to voters who will be going in November to cast a vote. Some may be doing it earlier than then with mail-in voting, and not be able to see evidence that may make them take a second look at Donald Trump if they are on the, the fence about him. So, that's in play as well. But what I'm just so fascinated about is just how novel all of this is, and how Judge Cannon and Jack Smith and, the New York case all are grappling with things that the U.S. justice system has never had to contend with. It all just speaks to how we've said unprecedented so many times, but really this has really been a test of the justice system and how to apply it to a president. So yes, it looks like right now it's benefiting him to be able to have something that has not been tested yet with immunity, and be able to have lawyers kind of run legal gymnastics around if he's immune from things.
Benefiting Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And if you look at the case, I know you all talked about this in last week's episode, but if you look at the case that Jack Smith has against Donald Trump related to January 6th, if you strip out what he may be considered immune for because he was president, what's left?
So what's going to be super interesting, and I think what we will get before Election Day, is this. Judge Cannon wants to move slow. Judge Tanya Chutkan in the D.C. court, she wants to move fast. A hearing hasn't been set yet, but there's going to be a hearing. The justices said, we're not going to get in the fact-finding business of deciding exactly what's official. We're going to create these guidelines. Chief Justice Roberts wrote the 6-3, basically party line opinion. Judge Chutkan can have an evidentiary hearing where she has to sort of assess, okay, what was official, what was unofficial. And Jack Smith can use that hearing to air a lot of evidence, perhaps evidence that the January 6th Congressional Committee did not unearth. And so it won't be a verdict, it won't be a trial, but that hearing where a bunch of the charges are going to get thrown out. The case is going to get narrowed because there was also this decision about obstruction, the Fisher case that the Supreme Court did.
Just a reminder about the Fisher case.
That's like the post-Enron Sarbanes-Oxley law, where the prosecutors were using it very broadly about impeding an official
and if people have just been like, wait, my head just exploded, let me just pause for one moment. So Fisher was this off-duty Pennsylvania police officer who was arrested and charged for acts that he did on January 6th. He pushed back against that. His case went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court did say that this precedent, which we looked back to for Enron, when you talk about what is interrupting or obstructing an official proceeding, that it was sort of used too broadly in his case.
Exactly. So that affects directly, I think, 2 of the 4 charges against Trump. It doesn't knock them out, but it does sort of narrow the parameters of the conduct that will be covered, and then everything Donald Trump was trying to do to like get the Justice Department to announce a probe. That clearly is going to be considered an official act based on the Chief Justice's decision. So anyway, I'm really watching for when does that hearing get scheduled, and then Judge Chutkan will make a decision and say this is an official act, this isn't an official act, and so then that will narrow things. Trump will then certainly appeal that, and so like it's going to all get caught up in this just delay process. But that evidentiary hearing, I think, is going to be like must-see.
Bottom line. If there is an evidentiary hearing prior to the election, that will be perhaps the closest Jack Smith and his team can get.
Ever.
Wow.
Yeah.
Ever, potentially, to showing the evidence they have, talking about their case against Donald Trump as they argue not the case itself, but argue what should be admitted as part of the case. And of course, our reporters will be covering that if and when it happens. And that will be really an important moment. So watch your calendars, listen to the podcast.
But you're also, and you're totally right. I don't want to give people like a false sense that Judge Chutkan will kind of keep everything intact. A lot of stuff is going to get knocked down, and what they're going to be left with is the kind of the least damaging stuff. Like Trump's speech at the ellipse,
like telling
which was
people
like a public speech that we all saw with our own eyes. That's the Trump people will argue that he was speaking as president, not as a candidate or the head of a party. But like ultimately the evidence that will be left is going to be much thinner gruel than the kind of the good stuff that Jack Smith has.
Yeah. All right, stay with us. We'll be back in just a moment to talk about what's happening next week in Milwaukee, a little thing called the Republican National Convention, which marches on despite all the other news that's swirling around right now. Stay with us. This is the Trump Trials Sidebar from the Washington Post. The Republican National Convention kicks off next week, and we will be there. Rhonda, James, and I will be there along with our Washington Post colleagues covering it all live. So Donald Trump will obviously not be in jail. He will not have been sentenced. He'll use this as fodder to claim political persecution. Let's talk about how his legal woes and some recent legal victories, not victories in which he was exonerated, but legal outcomes that have gone his way in terms of timeline, process, and what he can be charged on, how this all rolls into what we're going to watch next week, Rhonda.
Yeah, and we've been saying this a lot. This is sort of a part of Trump's playbook, is to use any sort of glimmer of hope from the Supreme Court decisions to, amplify it and take it on a victory lap and say, the Democrats are after me, Biden's after me, but I've been exonerated. He'll say things that have not happened yet, but he will use this. And his base will likely see this as the way he's seeing it, that he has been exonerated from these things, but which he hasn't. He has not, but he will, likely take some liberties in talking about the convictions and the cases that are on ice for now. What's interesting to me, and we had this conversation with one of our colleagues a little bit ago, is that the Hannity interview that he just did, he did not mention the convictions, which may actually give us a sense of how he might approach his nominee acceptance speech next week. He may try to get around it and not talk about it so that people forget about it for now. I mean, that would be a political strategy to use. So I don't know how much the convictions, the trial, how much that might play into the RNC and what happens there, but it is a cloud over, the Republican nominee or the presumptive nominee at this point, is that he does have these cases.
Donald Trump used to say in 2016 in his stump speech, if he was elected president, we'd win so much that people would get tired of winning. And it does feel like in Donald Trump's head, he's been winning so much that he's going to get tired of winning. He's been so lucky in his enemies. He's been so lucky in the Supreme Court coming to his aid, in Joe Biden, self-immolating, whatever word you want to use. And Trump has shown his like Truth Social page has been very toxic, but people aren't looking at it. They're not looking at all the retweets about how like Liz Cheney should be in prison and has committed treason. Which,
let's just pause there for a moment.
Yeah.
He said that Liz Cheney should go before a military tribunal.
Right.
Like that's
wild.
That's radical from someone who may again become president and would actually have the power to push that forward.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
And what has Liz Cheney done? She's just spoken out against him. Right. She's just, that's all. So. Yeah, I just had to like give a reality check there.
So Trump went like 11 days from the debate until his like Hannity interview, and then he had a rally, and he, by all accounts, his advisors have sort of convinced him that the Republican convention is this effort to like present him as more moderate, to sandpaper his rough edges, to kind of like present himself as someone who's not crazy and extreme. And he's tried to distance himself from Project 2025,
right.
And he's like trying very hard. And obviously, part of the role of the media is to fact check those kinds of efforts. But it will be fascinating because you're absolutely right. Like I'm being politically persecuted because I'm standing between the government and you works great in a Republican primary context. But right now, that's not his job. He won the nomination. His job is to win the general election. And
so will he be able to make that pivot, right?
That's
because
the big question.
He's so much more comfortable in that space of I'm the victim and I'm going to come out swinging for me and for you. Can he bottle that back up? Because on Truth Social, he's not bottling it up, but no one's looking at it. So it hasn't been as relevant. So we'll see.
I mean, his speech next Thursday night is going to be must-see TV.
And that's when he accepts the nomination. That's what James is talking about. We'll have it live on the Washington Post.
And does he, in 2016, he read from a teleprompter. And in 2020, he read from a teleprompter. He still said stuff that was wild. But if, how disciplined is he going to be? That doesn't mean that's how he'll be as president if he wins, but that is, I think, one of the big themes as we cover this convention. Does he sort of try to downplay the stuff that got him the nomination again? But it is so core to who he is and his identity and his kind of like victimhood, martyrdom, that he's really built his whole candidacy around.
Yeah,
so go ahead, Rhonda.
I was just going to say, it's another question of what Trump will we get next week. We might get, the Trump you had at the debate who tried to gloss over things. And I'll also add to him trying to build distance between his run and Project 2025, saying he doesn't know the people who wrote it, even though we've reported that his campaign, folks who are involved in the campaign have been also involved in this. He also built distance from the issue of abortion.
Yeah.
He released his platform, and a lot of people are talking about, wait a minute, this was the party that said that they were going to reverse Roe v. Wade. That happened, and now he's
because of him. He nominated.
He's appearing as if it's one of these distant issues. That all speaks to something. Actually, James, you said this. This has now been weeks ago on the vodcast. You said once that Trump wants to win this election, and that's it. That's the primary focus. And yes, that sounds obvious, but he wants to win this to the point he is trying to make people forget his first 4 years or his first term if he gets a second, and forget everything he said, even if it's things he said last week. He is going to work hard to reverse that and try to make people not remember it. So that shows you he is in this to win it for sure. This is really not a game for him this time around.
It makes him more willing to take advice from people like Susie Wiles and Chris LaCivita instead of, I think 8 years ago he thought, well, if you're so smart, how come I'm the nominee and you worked for all the losers? And now he sort of, I think, understands some of the value that comes from veteran political operatives. And because he's eager to get out of the legal jeopardy in these federal cases, I think he is more willing to accept advice because he is determined to pull this out. I think he now, especially because he was president for 4 years. I think in 2016 he didn't think he was going to win, and this time he wants it, and you can sense that when you watch him. I watched his whole Doral rally live the other night, and you could feel that there's something different than before. It's not just anger. It is kind of he's experienced now at running for office, but he clearly is kind of more of a politician than he used to be because he wants to win. Even as he's still showman, he's putting on a show, but he clearly, there's something different than 4 years ago or 8 years ago.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
There'll be a different theme each night of the RNC along the lines of wealth, safety, strength, and MAGA again. We'll see how much Trump is able to hew to that and his team. Of course, he'll speak the last night. We'll see a lot of lead up going into that. And one of the people who will be presented next week is his vice presidential pick. And we are waiting to see who that will be. Let's talk about who's on the short list.
I thought you were about to break the news. I thought you were going to, and his vice presidential pick is...
I know, guys, I just, hold on a second. Yeah. Okay, no, I don't have it. Seriously, we don't know who it's going to be. There is a short list, Rhonda, but I give this caveat. Even as we talk about the short list, it could really be anybody because Trump goes off on a wild hair sometimes. So talk to us about who's on the short list, why, and then James, give us throw in some other wild cards, please.
Yeah. So we again, I've always said this in our political.
So
she does. She really actually is very consistent about it.
We don't know anything. We do not.
No, we do. We know a lot.
We
know
we don't know everything.
Yes, but we cannot confirm anything.
Well,
we
we come at it from an informed perspective, but there's always the chance that something crazy could happen, and you're usually right when it does.
Which is why people have to tune in and read our paper as well. So what we do know, and this goes back to about a month ago, that the campaign did send out vetting material to Doug Burgum, who is the former North Dakota governor. He also ran in the primary for this position that Trump will likely get next week. Also, Senators J.D. Vance from Ohio, the junior senator from Ohio, and Marco Rubio. So those are the three names that we're thinking about right now. I believe Tim Scott also got vetting materials, but we are uncertain if he is still in that short list. We'll see. Again, we just don't know. But these three individuals, Burgum, Vance, and Rubio, are the folks that we are kind of eyeing right now. We're looking at their travel schedules, trying to figure out if they will make the cut.
So some of the other names that were vetted are Tom Cotton, the Republican from Arkansas, Ben Carson, who was the 2016 candidate and served as housing secretary, and Byron Donalds, a Republican congressman from Florida.
Who's also African-American.
Who's also African-American. But our sources tell the Post that it really is our colleagues who were covering this really full time say that their sources tell them it's down to two, that it's down to Vance and Rubio, but that Burgum is still in the mix. The big knock on Burgum right now in Trump world, and Trump actually said this in a radio interview on Wednesday with Brian Kilmeade, is that as governor of North Dakota, Doug Burgum signed a 6-week abortion ban. And Trump said on the radio, that makes it tricky for me. What's interesting is that when Burgum was running for president, he said, yeah, I signed the 6-week ban because that's right for North Dakota, but I would not sign any national ban. He was sort of ahead of the curve. He was ahead of Trump, certainly, on that. And so, is that actually disqualifying? Clearly, Trump sees Dobbs as this huge political problem for him, which is why, as you were talking about, he neutralized it in the platform. So, I think we could have a curveball, but it does seem like at this hour, and anything could happen. I really when people could watch this tape tomorrow and be like, wow, those guys are so dumb. They didn't even mention Elise Stefanik or Sarah Huckabee Sanders or, whoever it ends up being.
Right.
But it feels like it, it's really narrowed down.
Okay, I want to play some tape. I want to roll the tape because our colleague Michael Caden had put together a greatest hits tape of the two guys who are at the top of the list, Marco Rubio and J.D. Vance, giving past criticism of Donald Trump. This tape goes back to 2016. I'm just going to roll the tape. Let's listen and watch. And a reminder, this is them in the past because they have a very different message now. Let's listen.
It's difficult to understand why so many of these folks have been attracted to Donald Trump. Trump is the first person to at least see these communities, even if you think, as I do, that he doesn't have all the solutions. There is definitely an element of Donald Trump support that has its basis in racism or xenophobia. But a lot of these folks are just really hardworking people who are struggling in really important ways. I'm a never Trump guy. I never liked him.
He's like 6'2", which is why I don't understand why his hands are the size of someone who's 5'2". Have you seen his hands? And you know what they say about men with small hands? You can't trust them.
If he builds the wall the way he built Trump Towers, he'll be using illegal immigrant labor to do it. If he hadn't inherited $200 million, you know where Donald Trump would be right now? Selling watches in Manhattan.
Then he asked for a full-length mirror. I don't know why, because the podium goes up to here, but he wanted a full-length mirror. Maybe to make sure his pants weren't wet. I don't know. You all have friends that are thinking about voting for Donald Trump. Friends, do not let friends vote for con artists.
That's archival tape of Marco Rubio, and before him, 2 clips of J.D. Vance bashing Donald Trump. Now, bashing is a normal part of politics, especially when, like Marco Rubio, you're running against Donald Trump for the nomination back in 2016. However, they were going low. And part of that was Rubio was responding to Trump, making very personal attacks against him and other candidates. What do you guys think when you hear that old tape? That these guys could be his running mate, Rhonda.
Yeah, I think we've grown used to Republicans in particular who have spoken out against Trump and then come into the fold. We've seen it a lot. However, I do think these are 2 striking examples. Particularly with J.D. Vance. I know I covered his race for Senate, which was only 2 years ago. He's only been in the Senate, U.S. Senate, for 2 years. And I remember this being a little bit of a sticking point for voters with him, that he kind of made his mark on the national scene talking against Trump. He's also the author of Hillbilly Elegy, and he was on, national news. He tweeted out against Trump. That does take some explaining. But, again, we're in such strange political times that someone can speak that forcibly against someone and then be, side by side with them with the balloons coming down at the convention. Like here we are.
And there are precedents. This isn't totally unheard of. In 1980, Ronald Reagan, after winning the nomination, he ended up picking George H.W. Bush as his running mate, who had called his economic plan voodoo economics. And that convention was fascinating because it was in Detroit, and Reagan was negotiating until the final hours with Gerald Ford about being his running mate. And Reagan had challenged Gerald Ford in the primaries when he was the sitting president in 1976. And there was still some bad blood around that. So this kind of thing has happened before. But
there's bad blood, and then there's actually there's Marco Rubio making fun of Trump and really going for the the lowest sort of
literally below the belt. Yeah.
And then also with J.D. Vance having this nuanced critique of racism, of xenophobia, of, concerns about what it means to support this man, and then deciding just a few years later to overcome all that to run for Senate.
Yeah,
does it feel different to you guys
in that
sense
it
of
definitely is different.
The quality of
Exactly.
critique is not a political critique. It's a personal, moral, ethical critique as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I think to Rhonda's point, all of us covered, Rhonda's from Ohio. Rhonda covered the Ohio Senate race really closely. This was heavily litigated. The Republican opponents of J.D. Vance spent literally tens of millions of dollars on campaign commercials highlighting these and other clips. And Vance sort of he basically befriended Don Jr. That was his way into Trump world. He became buddies with Don Jr. and then sort of got right with Don Sr. So for us, this feels kind of it was litigated in 2022. But for most Americans who didn't closely follow that Senate race, I think it is going to be striking when they see J.D. Vance, if he's the VP, at the convention being like, Donald Trump is the most trustworthy person ever. And then you see that clip of him being like, Donald Trump never tells the truth. I think for a lot of people, it'll be but on the other hand, people are sort of well, that's politics,
Right.
And that's and we've seen Ted Cruz, at the 2016 convention, and then he debased himself so much to suck up to Trump. So I don't know. I think maybe regular people are that's just politics. But it is, Trump has an uncanny ability to get people to sort of compromise themselves, is maybe too strong a word, but debase themselves, certainly.
Evolve, grow, transform, accept. They might have different words for it, James. Okay, so what are you going to be watching, though, in the next couple of days? So tell us the timeline. The RNC starts next week, so just days away, and we don't know who the vice presidential pick is. What should we watch for this weekend, and what's the timeline? So
Trump keeps saying in all of his interviews on Fox News, on radio, with conservative talk hosts, that he really wants to like do this big reality show reveal of the VP during the convention, that he loves the idea. Traditionally, the nominee would come and the VP nominee would speak on Wednesday night, and he could roll him out, and everyone would be watching to see who it's going to be. The problem, which Trump has actually acknowledged, is that the rules of the Republican Party say that the presidential and vice presidential nominee need to be basically formally nominated on Monday. So you have to have the name to be able to nominate them. So that means that unless they change the rules, which they could, although we would know they were changing the rules, he would have to basically put out word of who it's going to be before Monday. I'm going to be closely watching Saturday night. There's a rally it's on the Pennsylvania side, but it's right on the border with Ohio, J.D. Vance's state. It's also very close to East Palestine, that place where that horrible train crash happened, where J.D. Vance has subsequently worked with Sherrod Brown, the Democratic senator, to introduce rail safety legislation. It sort of is a place with a good kind of story to tell. Maybe Vance could help in Western Pennsylvania. Trump previously this week on Tuesday night appeared at Doral, his golf course in Florida, with Marco Rubio, and basically hinted a bunch of pro-Rubio stuff. But if Trump is going to pick Vance, and that's an if, it would make a lot of sense to do it on Saturday night.
Right, yeah, the optics would be there. And also with the train derailment site, choosing that to be the site to announce this, remember Biden got a lot of criticism for not visiting. He took about a year. He went on near the year anniversary of the train derailment. And I know folks there, that was a raw point for them. And a lot of folks still there are still incredibly concerned with the aftermath of that derailment. So, that could be, for optics-wise, a good launching point for him to announce that. Or appropriate launching point.
Yeah, I will say that Trump needs to take back the spotlight, because even though the spotlight on Joe Biden right now and questions about his ability to run for re-election, serve as president again, even though that's all swirling and it's to Trump's and his campaign's benefit, Trump does not like the spotlight being off of him. And eventually he does need to pull it back, because he wants us to be talking about his vice presidential pick, who they are, what they're about, how they be as a running mate, how they be as a vice president, and the RNC next week. And when there's a lot of focus on Biden, there's not much more oxygen in the room left for Trump and his plans, James.
It's sort of stunning, honestly, for those of us who cover politics full time. This is really like one of the few times in the last 8 years where like Donald Trump has not been the center of attention for 2 weeks now. That has to be, I don't want to like psychoanalyze the former president, but that has to be hard for him. I mean, he clearly likes being the center of attention. If you're a campaign
operative, you're like, great. The focus is critical of someone else. If you're Donald Trump, though, you are used to the center of attention being you, and you're used to the spotlight, and we'll see if he can handle that moment well. Because when
your opponent is screwing up, let him. I mean, that's like
that's not
how he typically rolls.
Thinks, right? All right. Well, speaking of what's going to happen at the RNC, we will be live all of next week. That's starting right off the bat on Monday night. We'll be live Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, starting at 7:00 Eastern Time. You can find the Washington Post live coverage on our website, WashingtonPost.com, or on YouTube. Just look for Washington Post. You can subscribe there. Or just Google us, check us out, because we'll be bringing you the highlights of the convention, although we'll also be doing our analysis. We'll be talking to the reporters on the ground. James and Rhonda and I will be broadcasting live. We'll be there in the arena, bringing you the latest of what's happening. And then check us out next week in our regular Sidebar episode. We're actually going to release it Friday, because on Thursday night, Donald Trump takes the stage to become the official nominee at the RNC. So we'll tape right after that happens. We'll be able to bring you the latest of what's been going on the floor at the RNC all week long. Watch for our new episode in your podcast feed or on YouTube next Friday. That's all for us. We've got packing to do, planes to catch, final details to iron out. James and Rhonda, final thoughts?
That's exactly right. We need to, we're still working today, but we do need to get out of here.
But we're hitting this Thursday a couple hours ahead of this, but Joe Biden has a big press conference Thursday night. That'll be a big focus. If you've missed it, go back and look for us on YouTube. You can actually find it there after the fact as well, if you happen to have missed that. So we've got a lot of news coverage yet today on our Thursday, James.
The summer's never slow. I mean, there's this conventional wisdom that like the summer's for like vacation.
I mean, can we do some of that too, please?
And this feels like the campaign's becoming really an amazing
Needed.
story.
Yeah,
and I'm excited to get to cover it with you guys.
All right, we'll see you tonight here, basically, at the Washington Post, but we'll also see you next week at the RNC, and we look forward to catching all of you at the RNC next week as well. I'm Libby Casey. Talk to you soon.